Good evening, everyone. This evening on Blacklogic, we're going to cover a story that I've been following for quite some time now, and it's starting to get a lot of light. And what kind of sparked this video, what motivated this video, is a movie that's on Amazon Prime by the way of Stars called Alice. And I think Keke Palmer, she's the main actress, and her co-actor is Common. Now, before we get into that, I was on my Twitter page, and Black Alpha Network posted this clip from MSNBC of the Democratic plantation and all of its cronies are even disrespectful to the Black host. And it kind of just reminds me of some of the infighting that we have within our community by the way of proxy, meaning that we are essentially getting paid to disrespect ourselves. And it coincides with this video, family. It really does, because as we kind of comb through this, and we're going to slow walk this, okay? Unfortunately, this video is going to take a little more time than I would usually like it to be. But with that being said, family, let's go ahead and get into this first clip here so you know exactly what I'm referring to.
You were nominated for Speaker.
Yeah.
You've been in Congress one term.
Yes.
What were your qualifications to be Speaker of the House?
Well, look, I think my colleagues, they recognize my leadership, and they've seen it in many leaps and bounds.
Can you give specifics?
In one term. Secondarily, I've served before at the state level, now here at the federal level.
What were your specific qualifications to be Speaker?
I actually understand budgets. I understand what the long-term ramifications are.
What is the job of the Speaker? Hold on a second. We have to have a conversation.
I'm trying.
What is the...
Okay, so family, right there, what you're noticing is the host, I forgot her first name, but let's just call her Ms. Reed for the sake of argument, is being very, very hostile and very, very disrespectful to the nominee for the GOP party for the Speaker of the House, which is the third most powerful position in America. But nonetheless, she's not allowing him to even answer the question. And matter of fact, she's interrogating him to a point where he can't even complete a sentence until later into the video.
Cutting me off.
Hold on. What is the job of Speaker? Can you explain what the job of Speaker is? Because the job of Speaker doesn't have to do. Every single member of Congress has served in. Okay, what is the job?
The job of the Speaker of the House, number one, is to actually make sure that the Congress is operating on time. It largely sets the agenda for the conference. For the entire House of Representatives. It actually engages in negotiations with the Senate and the White House on major issues, key issues. The Speaker of the House has security clearances that most members do not have. You're number three, obviously, in line to the presidency, and there's much, much more. And the job is critical. Oh, and by the way, the Speaker of the House is also responsible for security at the
fundraising, right?
Course.
And so you've been there one term, and you're saying that you would be prepared after one term.
You know, family, again, this is very disrespectful, because after the gentleman answered the question, she went right back into his track record that he's only served on Congress for one term. Like, that is not significant enough for his experience in order to hold this position. Now, we have to understand the dynamic here that he is running under the Republican Party, and of course MSNBC and Larry Reed, Ms. Reed is mostly funded by Democratic Party. This is the way she keeps her job. But the hostility in this interview, family, it's just so disgusting that she had to go this low in order to get views.
Term to do the job that Speaker Pelosi and others who were in leadership. You ran for leadership, and you lost that leadership race to the congresswoman, a congresswoman who ended up being in leadership, right? So you were not elected to leadership, but you believe that though you've never served in leadership ever, and you've only served one term, that you believe you were qualified, because you got into it back and forth with a fellow congresswoman who was critical of the nomination, because it definitely looked like they were looking for a response to Hakeem Jeffries in you.
No, that was not anything.
Because you've literally been there for one term. So you've never been in leadership. I'm asking you the question.
I'm answering.
That's what, and the reason I'm asking that, I'm just going to ask you this question, is one of the things that, I don't know that you said it, but members have said, is that they wanted to highlight the diversity of the conference. There are 4 African-American members in the House caucus, the Republican caucus. There are 56 members in the Democratic caucus. So it's more diverse. There are more African-American members that are House committee ranking members they're at the same number that are actually members of the entire Republican House caucus.
Right.
So do you not believe that the idea was to make a diversity statement by nominating him?
Well, actually, first, that was not the idea, because I was in the room when the decision was made by people who chose to nominate me. That never came.
And you've still not explained how you're a prophet. You've never been in leadership.
Are you going to let me answer your question?
Sure,
or you
tell
want
us.
to talk over me? Okay. Number two, now let's go back. The reality is that a lot of members actually do believe in my ability to lead. They do. Am I to be despised for my youth because I've served one term, when members know that I have the ability to engage other members through the conference? But it's even bigger than that. Listen, we were at an impasse last week in our speakership elections. We got that done. Kevin McCarthy is now Speaker of the House. At the same time, I was working with members.
So, family, I just wanted to point that out very quickly, of the disrespect of any of those people who operate on the Democratic plantation and how they treat their own kind just because they are opposing political parties. Okay, before we essentially get into the heart of the video here, I just think that was very hostile. My hat goes off to Byron Donalds. I think, for the most part, from what I can see, he kept his cool, very respectful, even though she was very disrespectful. She was very hostile. She was very undermining anything he had to say, simply because he was a black man running under a GOP ticket. Now, for you guys that know me, I'm apolitical. I don't care about these political groups, but nonetheless, this is how they go after even the people that look and where you're from, your lineage, your heritage, simply because you disagree on politics. So that's what I have to say mostly about that. So without further ado, let's get right into the video. You know, guys, I've been trying to cut out the waste essentially by doing a lot of rambling and getting right into the heart of the video so you guys get the information to get out of here. So with that being said, I do apologize for the flickering. I guess I'm having some sort of technical issues, but we're going to keep rocking and rolling here. Now, to bring this video into context, let's first go over the Emancipation Proclamation. I know a majority of you guys are familiar with this. For you guys who have been absent-minded about the Emancipation Proclamation, we're going to go to a brief run through here. It says, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, as the nation approached its third year of bloody civil war. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are henceforth shall be free. Now, some people would like to argue that slavery in the northern states were already abolished, which is very false, which is very untrue. But if you notice the exact verbiage, and this is coming from a U.S. government website, archives.gov, it says that those people that's been held as slaves within the rebellious states, meaning within the Confederate states, mostly those southern states, are henceforth shall be free. And that was just kind of to get a larger population of manpower to enlist inside of the Union Army in order to combat and fight off the Confederates, okay? And again, the whole Civil War family, which people believe that Lincoln essentially did this to free the slaves. No, he did this to win the war, to stay in power. This is, again, a power trip when it comes to Civil War of America. Let me move on. Now, let's give more context. Now, this is coming from the librarycongress.gov. It states here that as a result, the mass of Southern blacks now face the difficulty Northern blacks had confronted, that of a free people surrounded by many hostile whites. One freedman, Houston Hatfield Holloway, wrote, "For we colored people did not know how to be free." That's because they was enslaved their entire lives from the day that they were born. And the white people did not know how to have a free colored person about them. The Reconstruction implemented by Congress, which lasted from 1866 to 1877, was aimed at reorganizing the Southern states after the Civil War, providing the means for readmitting them into the Union and defining the means by which whites and blacks could live together in a non-slave society. Okay, in a non-slave society. Let's move on. Now, slavery didn't end on Juneteenth, and we're going to cover Juneteenth, and it says here what you should have known about this important day. Okay, now Juneteenth gets his name from combining June and 19th, the day that General Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, bearing a message of freedom for the slaves there. It states here, upon his arrival, He read out General Order Number 3, informing the residents that slavery would no longer be tolerated. All slaves were now free and will henceforth be treated as hired workers if they choose to remain on the plantation, according to the Juneteenth website. So during that time, if you were still on the plantation, you should be getting paid, and you can leave at your own free will, essentially. It states here the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. Now, we have to understand this is almost like 6 months or a year after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 was signed. And I know a lot of states were essentially waiting for it to be signed into law, meaning that it was ratified later on in 1865. But nonetheless, Texas went out and wrote their own proclamation to upheld the federal law on the state level. Okay, so this kind of gives you some understanding there. It states here before the reading of General Order Number 3, many slave owners and Confederate states simply choose not to tell their slaves. This is very important for the entire video, family. This part is very important. They state here that states simply chose not to tell their slaves about the Emancipation Proclamation and did not honor it. They got away with it because before winning the war, the Union soldiers were largely unable to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation in southern states. Still, even though slavery in America would not truly come to an end until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Okay, and we're going to go over the 13th Amendment because that is very important. Here, a group of foundational Black Americans, U.S. freedmen, celebrating Juneteenth in 1880. Okay, now here's a story that is, and very quickly, let me jump over to the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment simply reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Why is the 13th Amendment very pivotal when it comes to slavery? Because it basically states that if you get convicted of a crime, they can enslave you, meaning having control over your body, meaning that you have no rights, that they could do whatever they want to you, incarcerated, you're not going free, and you're not getting paid for the work that you do. All right. Now, Slavery by Another Name. This book is by Douglas A. Blackman, and there's a very powerful story in here. We're going to go over it very briefly. I highlighted some things that I think that was pertinent to the conversation. It states here, on March 30th, 1908, Green Cottenham was arrested by the sheriff of Shelby County, Alabama, and charged with vagrancy. Vagrancy is simply you're being homeless, okay? Maybe you were asking people for money, but simply it just means that you're homeless, okay? It states here, recorded haphazardly or not at all in court records, and most telling in a time of massive unemployment among all Southern men, was reserved almost exclusively for Black men. Cottenham offense was being Black. After 3 days behind bars, 22-year-old Cottenham was found guilty in a swift appearance before the county judge. If you notice, you always have a speedy trial when they know they're already going to convict you as guilty when you're a Black person. Have you noticed that, family? No matter the crime, it's a very speedy trial. And it states here, the county judge, and immediately sentenced to a 30-day term of hard labor, right? 30-day term of hard labor. Listen to this. Unable to pay the array of fees assessed on every prisoner, fees to the sheriff, the deputy, the court clerk, the witness, Cottengham's sentence was extended to nearly a year of hard labor. So they knew that the young man, 22 years of age, was homeless. They knew he had no money. So they charged him with vagrancy, which I guess they labeled as a crime, gave him a 30-day sentence, charged him for court fees, right? Brought him into court. They incarcerated him. They imprisoned him, brought him into court, knew that he couldn't afford for anything, but charged him court fees. Then they had to extending him out to a year of hard labor because he could not pay the court fees they set upon him, right? Under a standing arrangement between the county and a bad subsidiary of the industrial titan of the North, U.S. Steel Corporation, the sheriff turned the young man over. Listen to this. Turned the young man over to the company for the duration of his sentence. In return, the subsidiary, Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, gave the county $12 a month to pay off Cottenham's fine and fees. What the company's managers did with Cottenham and thousands of other black men they purchased from sheriffs across Alabama was entirely up to them, meaning they had control over their entire person, meaning that they was in jail, they was in prison, they were enslaved. Cottenham was subject to the whip. Now, I want you guys to think about this. You get incarcerated, you go to jail, you go to prison, you're making license tags, you're breaking bricks, you're shoveling snow, you're raking leaves, whatever the case may be. These guys was essentially sold to the coal miners, and when they got out of line or when they didn't work as fast as they wanted them to, they was subject to whip, to being beaten. Okay, it states here, Cottenham was subject to the whip for failure to did the I can't even say the word, family, for the required amount that was subjugated to them in order to pay off his fine. Now, at risk of physical torture for disobedience and vulnerable to the sexual predations of other minors. So this is a 20-year-old kid, essentially young man, that was subjugated to the sexual predations of other minors, many of whom already had passed years or decades in their own confinement, meaning they've been there for years, predicated upon the amount they had to pay off in order to be free. The lightless catacombs of Blackrock, packed with hundreds of desperate men, slick with sweat and coated in pulverized coal, must have exceeded any vision of hell a boy born in the countryside of Alabama, even as a child of slaves, could have ever imagined. Waves of disease ripped through the population. It states here that almost 60 men forced into this mine was named Slope 12, were dead of disease, accidents, and homicide, meaning that people were even killing each other during this time. It states here that most of the broken bodies, along with hundreds of others before and after, were dumped into shallow graves scattered among the refuse of the mine. Family, essentially what we're reading here and what I've kind of gone through very briefly is a tall tale of stories anecdotal to this particular gentleman, but has happened thousands of times throughout this nation. Okay, thousands of times throughout this nation, and a lot of these stories go untold. So when people are questioning reparation, these are the stories that need to be told and the contextual information therein in order to combat their argument. And sometimes, family, listen, this country already knows what we have been through. A lot of these stories are known to the dominant society and those who upheld the system of white supremacy. They already know these stories. But again, they bank on the fact that you don't know these stories, so they play a fool. Now, it states here that Black people in the U.S. were enslaved well into the 1960s. More than, listen to this, don't forget that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed January 1st, 1863. More than 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, there were Black people in the Deep South who had no idea they were free. Because, family, they was not free. They were still enslaved. They were enslaved illegally, but nonetheless, they were not free. Now, according to that document, they were free, but they had no idea that they were free. Remember how we covered that a lot of the slave owners did not tell their slaves, or quote unquote, their freedmen, that they were actually free by the federal government. Okay. That's why I say that was very important for you to remember. Now, uncovered cases of Black Americans still living as slaves 100 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. There's evidence and proof that we had Black people on plantations still living as enslaved people up until 1973. I want to encourage all of you guys to go out to Prime Video and watch the movie Alice, where Keke Palmer is the leading actress and her supporting actor is Common. Okay? Very powerful film. It's not long, it's about an hour and 40 minutes. It states here, Carrie and her child Thomas have been appraised at $1,100. Okay? This is the lady here. I forgot to give her her respect. Let me go back up really quickly, family. Her name is Antoinette Harrell. She's the one who set out on the mission to find out the truth about this. Now, it states here, this was from Antoinette. I know a group of people who didn't receive their freedom until the 1950s. And so we keep thinking that slavery ended in 1863, or when it was ratified in 1865, or after Juneteenth, essentially. But no, up until the 1950s. Then you're going to read up into the 1960s. But the last date that there was around 19 plantations that had slaves on them up until 1973, family. And I'm thinking about this. A lot of us have been born in the 70s and 80s, essentially, right? Generation X going into the millennials. It states here, I know a group of people who didn't receive their freedom up till the 1950s. She had me over to her house where I met about 20 people, all who had worked on the Waterfield plantation in St. Charles Parish, Louisiana. They had become indebted to the plantation owner and were not allowed to leave the property. Okay, these were known as 20th century slaves. You're going to hear the word, if you kind of do your study on this, family, you're going to see the word peonage a lot when it comes to that, because they either call them peonage or they call them domestics. Okay, and essentially these are just code word for enslaved people. They believe that they might somehow get sent back to a plantation that wasn't even operating anymore. They're stating that when these people were freed, they were afraid to even tell their story of them being enslaved after the fact. Very important, family. They were afraid that they would be sent back to the plantation and do work. 6 months after that meeting, I was given a lecture on genealogy and reparations in Louisiana when I met May Louise Walls Miller. May walked in after the lecture was over, demanding to speak to me. She walked up, looked me in the eye, and stated, I didn't get my freedom until 1963. This lady was enslaved for an additional 10 years after the first group that Antoinette Harrell found out in the first place. But family, if you go out and if you go out and look at the movie Alice, you will see that this movie was taking place in 1973 in Georgia, right? And it's based on true events. You'll see that when the opening comes on. It states here that May's father, Kane Wall, lost his land by signing a contract he couldn't read that had sealed his entire family's fate. They were not permitted to leave the land and were subject to regular beatings from the landowners. When May got a bit older, she would be told to come up to work in the main house with her mother. Here she would be raped by whatever men were present. Most times she and her mother were raped simultaneously along each other. Mother and daughter in the 1960s on a plantation could not leave and were beaten and raped regularly and sometimes simultaneously beside each other. Her father, Kane, couldn't take the suffering anymore and tried to flee the property by himself in the middle of the night. His plan was to register for the army and get stationed far away. Now, I want you guys to think about this, because the father was going to run away and get stationed far away by leaving his wife and by leaving his daughter. Just let that Just let that take home for a bit, family. I think it's important that you are willing to abandon your family and not sacrifice and get them all out of there at the same time. But I digress. I digress. It states here he was picked up by some folks claiming they would help him. Instead, they took him right back to the plantation where he was brutally beaten in front of his family. When May was about 14, she decided she would no longer go up to her house. Her family pleaded with her as the punishment would come down on all of them. Now, the reason why she didn't want to go back up to the house, because every time she went up to the house, she was being raped. She was either being raped and beaten or raped and beaten. May refused and sassed the farmer's owner's wife when she told her to work. Worrying that May would be killed by the owners, Cain, her absentee father who was going to abandon them, beat his own daughter bloody in hopes of saving her. That evening, still covered in blood, May ran her way through the woods. She was hiding in the bushes by the road when a family rode by with their mule cart. The lady on the cart saw the bushes moving. She got off to find May crying, bloody, and terrified. The White family took her in and rescued the rest of the Walls later that night.
A former slave until the 1960s, but we uncovered a present-day plantation. We're concealing the identities of those living on this plantation to protect them from any repercussions.
If you had housing in the city which you moved, where you would pay like $70 a month?
Well, as long as it's around where I stay at, yeah, I can do that.
You know, we couldn't get them to say anything about the owners on camera, but they explained to us off camera exactly what was going on, and they said to us if we were able to get them off of the plantation, that they would give us the full story on camera.
They would bring my mother to the house, and when they bring my mother to the house, one of us would have to go with my mother, so the master said. And so this was the particular time that I had to go with my mom. So my mom. And when it came to me, I was sitting there crying because, when you don't know what's going on, I was sitting up there crying in this. And so the lady said, they coming to me. So the master's wife said to him and the other brothers or whoever they were, and she said, and they was sort of looking, and she said, oh no, honey, no. And she says, she's not even a heifer yet. I didn't learn what that word was till over in the 70s. And she said, she's not even a heifer yet. She's just a yearling. You can't.
So was she basically stating, and this is the lady's story that I just read about, family, and she was very, very young, and they was wanting to rape her, but they were stating, hey, no, she's way too young. She's not a heifer. She's not, as an adult age, she's just a kid.
But they gagged my mouth, and they raped me just like they did my mama.
Family, this is a very compelling story of a traumatic event that occurred for a very long time of this lady, and I'm glad that she made it out, but I don't know if she'll ever be the same. But as a young child, they gagged her mouth and raped her.
And there I was laying in that pile of blood. A little bitty girl didn't know what to do, and his wife had to clean me up. But that never stopped.
A former slave.
Family, what's crazy about that story is essentially the slave owners, and I'm gonna call them what they are, slave owners' wife, said, no, hey, listen, she's way too young to go through that. Let's not do that to her. And they gagged her, and they still raped her ravishly over and over again for years. And after the first time, the slave owner's wife had to clean her up because she laid in her whole pile of blood as a very young child. Family, no one knows, especially not a large base population, of what our people have been going through up until 1973, which is recorded, of enslaved Black Americans still working on plantations, not getting paid, not being able to leave, getting beaten, getting whipped, and getting raped. Let's back up a little bit. How the end of slavery led to starvation and death for millions of Black Americans. It says here, the freeing of slaves as a triumph, writing for the wrongs of Southern plantation system that kept millions of Black Americans in chains. After combining through obscure records, newspapers, and journals, Downs, who the author, believes that about a quarter of the 4 million free slaves either died or suffered from illness between 1862 and 1870. He writes in the book that it can be considered the largest biological crisis of the 19th century. See, things on this magnitude, as far as the data, the amount of our people who has been tortured and killed and died, who have been, who has been exposed to these diseases by the European hybrid, the people who are in the dominant society in the system of white supremacy. But this is what our people have been through. These are the stories that are not told. Now, we talked about the different states that up until Juneteenth, Texas still had slavery, did they not? And we would like to believe that those northern states had freedmen, or essentially have freed Black Americans. Well, Delaware and Kentucky rejected all efforts by the Union to end slavery, and these two border states firmly rejected the 13th Amendment. They firmly rejected federal law. They firmly rejected the 13th Amendment, and as a result, slavery remained perfectly legal in both states for another 6 months after Juneteenth. See, the reason why I wanted to back up here, family, I wanted to show you that we essentially had modern day slavery up until 1973, where some of these people didn't even know that they were free. Generations. And if you go watch that movie, Alice, and I'm just promoting it for a reason here, family, because there was a time, and we're going to see it here in a little bit, this is a small clip, where she's running away from the plantation and hits a road and doesn't even know what a road is. A vehicle, 18-wheeler stops where Common is driving, and she doesn't even know what a vehicle is, meaning that she has never left the plantation. It states here, until the Secretary of State certified that the 13th Amendment had been ratified by enough states to become law through the U.S. As mentioned above, slavery had also been perfectly legal in many northern free states. Listen, as mentioned above, slavery had also been perfectly legal in many northern free states at the time of the Civil War under certain circumstances, and while those intentionally loopholes has gradually been closing, there certainly remain states on the Union side where there continue to be legal slavery after the Civil War. Because, family, for a very long time, people would tell you, oh, no. After this and after that, there were no slavery in the northern states. It was only in the southern states, which is a damn lie. Because even one of the most liberal states, okay, as a result, California had roughly 200 to 300 enslaved people at the end of the Civil War, and Juneteenth did nothing to change that. So they're saying, hey, hundreds of people in California were still enslaved after Juneteenth. Think about that. People was harping on Texas. You guys still had slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation, even after it was ratified, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But now we found out that California even had slaves after Juneteenth. Who else had slavery after Juneteenth? New Jersey, and as well as Oregon, family. As well as Oregon. These states had slavery even after Juneteenth. So hopefully they're not turning their nose up at Texas, because all of them are a system of white supremacy. Fair use, fair use. Family, they're not even letting me show it here.
Be ashamed to lose her.
I try to show you guys a clip very quickly, but Amazon with their powerful AWS program won't even let me share the screen here. So we're going to have to skip this part. But like I said, family, go out and watch the movie. I think it'd be telling of the information that you find within. If you can see, I'm just getting flashes because they block it when you share it. All right. But for the most part, family, that's the video for today. I thank you all for joining. I see Chanel Victoria. Good evening to you all. I see Armageddon. It says America is an elaborate lab prison for our people. Indeed, it is. And for you guys who just joined in, please like and share and subscribe to the channel. Support the channel. Also, if this is your first time to the channel, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you, Jermaine Anderson. Always being good at your job, sir. I do appreciate it. Believe me, I do. Well, that's all I have for you guys this evening. And understand that empowerment is an action. I see you guys on the next one. I'm out.